So let's talk about child development and what you need to know about child development as the director or as the head of school, assistant director, as a leader at your school, because it's very different than what you need to know if you're a classroom teacher. The classroom teacher needs to be an expert in child development for their age group. We need to know it in the broader perspective. We need to know what is normal, what is abnormal, what causes behavior, what are different methodologies to address perhaps problematic behavior, and is this problematic because the teacher isn't comfortable with it, or is it socially inappropriate? We need to know those kinds of things. And we also need to know broader cultural perspectives on parenting and child rearing and what is acceptable and what's not. We have a different perspective, or we should, than a classroom teacher. So the number one thing here is that we have to know developmental norms. That's where the checklists come in. There's checklists in the workbook. There's checklists all over the internet. Get one that works the way your brain works. Just because the one that I put in the workbook works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for other people. So you need a developmental checklist that's going to work for you. And it can be one that you're using to do parent communication with. It does not matter. There needs to be a quick snapshot that you can use to go, yeah, that's not what is normal for that age group. Because sometimes we get a little lost in, well, this is what the other kids in this age group at my school are doing right now. But maybe those kids have been with you for 3.5 years. And so they have different social skills or different communication skills than kids who come into your program on their 3rd week. Okay. So you need some form of a checklist that you can use to double check when you think something is unusual, or when a parent or when an employee thinks that something's unusual. So you need to have a good handle on developmental norms. I've been doing this for decades and decades, and I still occasionally check a checklist. It's okay to use that, okay? We also need to remind our staff to focus on what is normal for that child, because what's normal for that child is not necessarily what is the universal norm. So I had one child who was at our schools who it was a verbal savant. He could say anything he wanted, but he didn't really get into all of the social interactions with other kids. He was a talker, not a doer. So he liked to go and report what was happening instead of getting into conflicts. So that's what is normal for him. If he starts getting into a lot of disagreements or physical altercations, which might be completely developmentally appropriate for that age, but it's not developmentally appropriate for that child, that is not his norm, something is going on with him. Okay, does that make sense? So we need to know what developmental norms are, and to the extent possible, we would like to know the norms for the different kids or the different classrooms, but we need to encourage our staff to really think about what are the norms for their kids. I was going to say for their clients. The next big thing is to know what the developmental imperatives are throughout all the age ranges, throughout all of the developmental stages. Because a lot of times the thing that drive adults crazy about children's behavior is stuff that is developmentally imperative, meaning they have to do it. We have to help them find an appropriate way to do it that is not going to cause mass chaos. For instance, 4-year-olds have to tattle. They have to do it. And if you make it such that they can't do it, it is going to impede their development of an understanding of how the world works. Tattling is their way of checking whether the world is random or whether it's fair. And so they're going to do this until they feel safe in whichever decision they made about how the universe works. They're going to keep tattling. And if you make it impossible for them to tattle, it's going to prolong this period of development. So instead, we need to give them opportunities to tattle and ways to tattle that are going to work. Okay? Reporting, tattling, talking about the difference. Yes, that's important. But you need to know what the developmental imperative is behind that activity and remind our staff when there's biting happening in a classroom, when there's name calling happening in a classroom, when there is running happening in a classroom, all of the negative behaviors that you might have a group doing is happening because it's developmentally imperative. We play Ring Around the Rosie all around the world with different names because it's a developmental imperative. We have to have some rough and tumble play. So that's part of our job as the director, is to look at it from further back and go, okay, but what is going on? Why does that child have to do that thing? We need to be the cooler heads, because otherwise when kids misbehave, you're going to end up disenrolling families because we don't have a good understanding of the fact that biting is just a developmental imperative and it's going to happen, and it's how we respond that determines what happens. Okay, that leads to the next thing, which is observation. Our job as the director is to come in and do observations in a classroom to see what is happening when things are out of control. What can we do? What can we see? What's happening in the classroom? By being removed, by being the administrator, we're not as invested in the outcomes in the classroom as the teachers. And we're not going to get defensive when what we see is that the physical layout of the classroom is not meeting the needs of the current group of kids. So one of our jobs as a director is to do observations in the classroom, or as a school leader. It may not be the director's job. It may be a curriculum coordinator or assistant director, but someone on the administrative staff needs to have the observational skill, right? And we get to use all of our knowledge of child development and what we observe and what we know about developmental imperatives to help the staff to do problem solving on how do I challenge this child? This child seems to be bored, and so they're acting out. This child seems to be bored and, you know, they're not very interested. How can I take my math experiences up to another level? What can we do to bring in more gross motor into this classroom? The problem solving is, again, part of what we bring as the leaders of the school to child development situations, whether it's how do we enrich this program, how do we slow something down for a child who's having a hard time in a developmental area, maybe we help with the developmental assessments, all of those kinds of things. Part of that is that when there is a child who is not developing typically, we are the ones who are going to make the call as to whether we need to call early childhood intervention services or we need to document it and send it on to the pediatrician. Because if we see something not progressing typically, we see that child for hours and hours and hours a day, where the pediatrician is going to see them maybe 15, maybe 30 minutes in a doctor's visit once every 3 to 6 months. We see them for hours and hours and hours every day. And if there's a child who is having some hearing loss or is having some sensory motor processing issues, or looks like maybe they might be having some cognitive processing issues, we're going to notice that first, us or the parents. One of us is going to notice it first. And so we need to be there to support doing the documentation and the referral. Okay. So you're going to be involved in that anytime there's a child who is gifted and talented or is delayed or has some sort of physical challenge. And that means we're going to be communicating with parents when there are difficult things to tell them. Like, we think that your child needs an assessment. That is your job as the director, to know the norms, to know the developmental imperatives, to do observations, to problem solve with our staff, and to communicate with parents. We are here as the support staff for our teachers when it comes to child development. We are the support staff when it comes to child development. There is way more information on child development than we could fit into the entire class. We could spend hundreds and hundreds of hours on child development. We're choosing not to, because there are better resources out there for that than we could be. Please find them. We are going to give you some links to some possible places to get your initial additional child development information. There are hundreds of books. We're only listing a few. Please continue to reach out and look for more resources in this area, but remember what your 5 jobs are in this area.